everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Online Warriors podcast. This week, we are all on vacation, so we're going to give you guys a little bit of a treat. We're going to revisit our interview with Greg Edmonson. He is the multi-BAFTA award-winning composer of some of your favorite scores in some of your favorite franchises like Uncharted, Firefly, and more. So that's coming up for you guys. We'll be back next week with a full episode. And until then, enjoy the interview. But before I go, I would also be remiss if I didn't shout out our wonderful Patreon producer, Mr. Stephen Keller. Give it up for Stephen. He has been supporting us at the night level on our Patreon over at www.patreon.com/onlinewarriorspodcast. As a result of his patronage, he gets guest spots on the show, he gets access to our secret monthly segment, our monthly vlog, and he gets to vote on trivia quizzes. So thank you, Stephen. You are wonderful. And now let's get to the interview.
All right, so today we have a super special guest joining us on the show. He's the man responsible for the epic scores behind some of your favorite series and some of our favorite series, the Uncharted video game series, Firefly, which a lot of people think had too short of a span on television. And he's also a two-time BAFTA award winner. This is music composer Greg Edmonson. Greg, welcome to the Online Warriors podcast. It's a thrill to have you here.
Honored to be here. And quite looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was just telling you before we started in here, you know, a lot of people right now are talking about their Spotify Wraps. They're getting back. How do they listen to music throughout the entire year? My entire basically summary of that was movie scores and video game scores. So for me, for someone who has a serious love of the genre, it's a huge thrill for me to have you here, and it's a huge thrill for all of us. So, you know, we can dive right in, and I guess you can just tell us a little bit about how you quote unquote broke into the industry, whether you had an educational background in this, what that looked like, and what got you started with film and video game scoring.
I did have a background in this. When I moved to Los Angeles from Dallas, Texas, because this industry at that point in time didn't exist in Dallas, Texas. Really, Los Angeles was the only place that existed. So I moved here, and first I was working as a guitar player, a studio guitar player, just kind of, you know, playing on other people's projects. But early on, I had an opportunity to work for a company called Hanna-Barbera. They did a lot of animation.
Of course I know Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah, and so that was my first gig, was Hanna-Barbera. I didn't stay there very long. I ended up working with a guy named Mike Post, who was really big in television. And he invited me to come over and start working on TV shows, and I did. So even though I had a background in music, I then had to study privately, which I did for years in Los Angeles, because film and TV and video game scoring is now a big deal. And you know, colleges and universities have classes that you can take, and they have programs, but they didn't at that point in time. So everything you learned was pretty much classically oriented. Well,
right.
You know, film and TV and video games mix all the genres together. So
right.
It was kind of a learn as you go thing. And people gave me the opportunity to learn while I was doing. And how lucky is that?
Right. I mean, one of the things, you know, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I have to imagine, you know, having a background in classical composition, there's still a lot you have to learn to do film and video game scoring, because I think probably one of the finer points of that is knowing when your score needs to, you know, get out of the way for dialogue, and you still want to be present, but you don't want to be overbearing. So there's probably a lot like that I imagine goes into it, but you're the expert, not me, then again.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, classical scoring is meant for, let's just call it, let's say, the concert hall. So you try to make everybody's part completely interesting all the time. I mean, that would be the ideal thing. But you're absolutely right. In film or TV, if dialogue is going on, you're just a part of the storytelling team. So you're surrounded by, hopefully, great actors, a great script, great lighting, and it's a whole bunch of people together telling a story rather than just music being the story in and of itself. So, you know, legit writing is concert writing, but writing for film and TV is being a part of the storytelling process with other people who have a completely different discipline than you. But hopefully they're great at what they do, and you just want to all come together and make the story be the most important thing.
Right. That also resonates with me, especially we're going to talk about Uncharted, of course, but Uncharted as a video game experience is very story driven. And, while you are this treasure hunter, it's kind of bombing around. There's an emotional core to it. And your music, among other things, provides that emotional core. And like you said, I have to imagine it's a collaborative experience. So that's super cool to hear.
By the way, Uncharted was a joy to work on. And the reason that game had heart, at least this is my opinion, it was created by a woman named Amy Hennig.
Mm-hmm.
And early on, we'll get into the details early, but early on, she told me, I'm not making games for teenage boys, not because there's anything wrong with that. It's just because they've got a whole bunch of games already. So she said, I want to make a game that can draw people in who maybe weren't interested in gaming or didn't know they were. And so I'm going to start by writing a really good script and try to make characters that people care about.
Right.
And she did.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's a unique experience, as a game. And yeah, we will talk about it. But, that's interesting to hear. And that's something that I have to admit, I didn't know, even as a fan of the franchise. But you make a good point that it's, teenage boys, they have so many options for games, right? But you want to try to make something that's more all-encompassing than that.
Yeah, that's what she was trying to do.
Right.
Only because and by the way, it was in no way disparaging towards teenage boys. She was just going, they've already got a bunch of them and a bunch more coming. I just want to draw people in. And the key to that for her was creating characters that people cared about, because she was the writer and the game director as well. And a lot of times that's not the case. You have a writer and then a game director, same as you do on a film. Right. You have the screenwriter, but then somebody else directs it and tells the story that they perceived out of the script. So because she was everything, she had control over everything. So she knew exactly the story she was trying to tell. She tried to cast it with people who could make that story come to life. Uncharted happened after the demise of Firefly. And if you look at Firefly and you enjoyed it, there are similarities between Nathan Drake and Mal Reynolds.
Well, so that's interesting too, because a lot of people think that, if Uncharted is now getting a film franchise, but a lot of people were lobbying for years for Nathan Fillion to play Nathan Drake. So I can totally see the parallels.
There were some parallels. They were both flawed human beings who would sometimes say and do the wrong thing, but in the long run, they were always going to do the right thing. Right. And that's just like, that's who we are as human beings. That's our experience. That's what we do. We do the wrong thing, and we just hope that in the long run, we end up doing the right thing. So it's goofy, but there were parallels between those two characters. So it was an easy transition writing for one and moving over to the other.
I mean, I feel like, too, that development in video games and bringing that kind of heart and story and real life characters, like you were talking about, to life is kind of what's made the video game industry a little bit more mainstream and have such a wide appeal. I mean, we've seen the growth of the industry in the last 10, 20 years. And I think a lot of that is just the storytelling and the great characters and heart that those kind of games like Uncharted are really bringing to the industry.
Once somebody raises the bar, and by the way, this is going on in television now. This is a great time for television. There are so many great shows, and because the bar has been raised, everybody has to rise to the occasion. So they can't just put out a show. It has to look good. It has to sound good. And the fact that they're making 10 episodes a year, thank you, Game of Thrones, instead of, when I first started, a TV season was 26 shows. That's a lot. By the time you do 26 shows, you are worn out. And everybody working on the show is worn out. That's just a lot, because TV shows come so fast and furious. You finish one and they go, okay, we got to start on the next one this afternoon because, it goes on the air next Friday. Oh, God, okay. Now TV series are, at least on network TV, are about 22 episodes a year. But all the ones on Netflix and everywhere else are about 10 episodes a year. So it's great for writers. Instead of just having to crank it out and say, we got to make 22 shows, they go, let's make 10, but let's make every one of them really good. So that raises the bar. And the same thing has happened in video games. And Uncharted was a big part, I believe, of starting to raise that bar so that people were telling stories worth telling, stories that you could remember, and creating characters that people cared about. Once the bar gets raised, everybody else sees that, and they kind of go, well, we're going to have to do that in our next iteration or our next game. We're going to have to do that exact same thing. So the competition, and it's friendly competition, just makes it better for everybody. And the ultimate recipient is the person playing the game. The gamer is who everybody cares about. How can we make this experience great for them? So that's kind of how that happens.
Right. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree. You hear a lot, right, about like we used to be playing Space Invaders where if there was a story, it was not really a story at all. And to see how far we've come, and I think I completely agree with you that Uncharted was a huge stepping stone there in that it became this. I mean, Uncharted has this like extremely cinematic quality, right? And again, you're contributing to that, and it's been so cool to see. And like you said, other people see that and see how successful that franchise has been, and said, okay, let's try and emulate that in terms of at least its best aspects, which is the storytelling quality. One question I had, I guess, in the course of some of the things you just said, in terms of TV, and we can use Firefly as a proxy or other projects you've worked on there, but when you are recording a score for an entire season's worth of television, do you do that all at once, or is it a weekly grind, much like I would imagine the writer's room is?
For me, it's always been a weekly thing. You're not creating a library. You're literally just scoring every second of the show so that you can be emotionally there for every second of the show. There are some TV shows on cable where they create a library and then just toss the library in. It's not really effective scoring.
Right.
But it's putting music that at least all came from the same place into a show. In a perfect world, the composer wants to write music to the picture because, when there's something interesting going on, it moves and it shifts and you have to be there and the music has to move and shift with the story. So at least in my journey, everything has been you score every second of every show.
Right. And that practice, I would imagine, starts, you get the script and you read it, or are you literally getting the cut of the show that doesn't have any music in it and they come to you and say, okay, we need scoring for this? It might be a little bit of both. It might be one or the other.
Television is so crazy. Everything you said happens at the beginning of the season. And then after about episode 3, it doesn't happen anymore because everybody's just too busy. If they send you a script, you don't read it. If they send you a rough cut of the show, it doesn't matter because it's going to change.
Right.
It's when they send you the final cut of the show that you look at it and you start and you soak it all in, and then you start writing, because now anything you write might be a keeper because the show's not going to change, hopefully. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes I would look at the rough cut. They always make a rough cut because I have to show the network the rough cut of the show. But you don't always see it because you're pretty much busy working on last week's episode still. Music and post-production are the guys at the very end of the line. The screenwriters have to create everything before the first day of filming. So all through the whole process, whenever anybody runs behind, it comes out of your time.
Right. Now,
so sometimes they come to you and they go, hey, listen, we only have 3 days, but it still has to air on Friday. So,
and I would probably imagine, right, that I don't know that video game scoring works the same way, but I imagine that in that framework you just laid out for television, that puts you directly in the line of fire in terms of deadlines, right? So that had to be a lot of stress for you relative to maybe the video game schedule where you have this game and yes, you still have deadlines, but I don't know if you're the person that is kind of in the pole position there that is going to be taking the heat. Are you last in line in that process as well?
No, that's a completely different process.
Right.
Television is, of course, governed by the schedule. If your show airs on Friday, then you got to have it finished on Thursday. So that's just a given. It's what you signed up for, and whatever you have to do to make that happen, you do. Video games are a completely different animal, and it's changing. They used to crank out sequels, iterations really quickly. They don't do that so much anymore. Sometimes it's 4 years, between another Call of Duty or Uncharted. So you have lots of time to write, and it's a completely different kind of writing in one way. And then, of course, it's not in another way. But you have time on video games. You have time to think about things, to try things, to experiment, to see what's working. And it's a much more leisurely process. Once you get close to an orchestra session, and for Uncharted, we did We recorded twice at George Lucas's facility. It's called Skywalker Ranch in Marin County. And the third one we did at Abbey Road in London. And once you get close to the orchestra session, now all the pressure's on because every note has to be perfect because you really can't waste time with an orchestra fixing mistakes. They all have to be fixed, and that's on your team to make it be perfect. And, I'm surrounded by great people and people who cover my many mistakes and make them all be okay. And, the whole thing is just a team effort. But that's the pressure in a video game, is getting ready for the big session, because that's a lot of, in TV, when I used to do recording sessions with live players, I would have at the most 3 hours at Fox or Warner Brothers or Sony. And you had 3 hours and you did the show, and thank you very much. On a video game, at all those places, Skywalker twice and Abbey Road, you had the orchestra for a week. Oh, what a luxury, what a joy to be doing double sessions every day for a week. Fantastic. So, that's another difference. And that's why getting ready for a whole week of double sessions is a huge deal. That's a lot of prep. But before, until that, so let's crunch that into 3 or 4 weeks of a 4-year span. Well, there you go. That still leaves you 3 years plus of being able to think about things and do stuff and go back and look at it and see what you would change and, do all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So it does not get easier schedule-wise than writing for video games. Film is like TV. It's a little more elongated because you don't have another one coming after.
Right.
But it's still everything that happens in the process that runs late each time out of your time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's just the nature of the business, and that's how it works. So every composer in town has people who, if it's more than humanly possible, you can just hand it off to them and say, look, do it. Do some. We've worked together for years. Do this like I would do it. Here are some thematic devices that I'm using. And everybody has people that can help fill in for them because, if there's a release date on the film and it's not going to be moved, then there you go. In this era of COVID, release dates are getting moved like crazy. I think they've moved James Bond
4 or 5 times at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. It's more than a year, off of its original release. And they're doing that because why release a film that, if people can't go to the theater?
Right.
So I totally get it. But apart from, before that, release dates really didn't get moved unless it was an absolute disaster that could not be fixed.
Right, unless you needed rewrites or something.
The studio looked at it and said, we put so much money into this film and we don't like it. We don't think it's going to go. We don't think it's going to work. We've got to do some fixes, or we got to do something to keep the money coming in.
Right.
So that's one of the few reasons. They would never say, you know what, this is going to put the composer under terrible pressure. Let's just move the release date. That thought would never occur to them.
Right.
Not in a million years.
They would probably just say, I'll get another composer if this composer can't
exactly.
Right.
The studios think weird ways. Here's just a little bit of Hollywood history for you. The studio 20th Century Fox. Right?
Yes. Right.
There's a right next door, if you've ever been to Los Angeles, there is a huge complex of land where every high-end attorney, it's all high-rise buildings now, every high-end attorney, high-end everything has offices in Century City. Well, the reason it's called Century City is because 20th Century Fox went so over budget on a movie called Cleopatra.
Oh, right. Yeah. Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes. That they said, we need to sell some of our property to compensate for the money. So they sold this land for, who knows, maybe a couple of $1 million. And now it's worth billions and billions of dollars.
Right.
It was the worst business decision ever made.
But they needed
were trying to keep the books looking good. So that's why you have the century in both names, Century City, 20th Century Fox. There you go. Little Hollywood story there.
So I'm glad you brought up a little while back, you brought up the recording process and specifically the live recording process. And, in terms of television, I guess first, I imagine, maybe I'm wrong, but when you're recording this, is there a big screen where you're watching what's actually happening to get the beats right, to get any holes you have in the music to time them right? Or is that more intuition based? And I guess I would also ask the same question about video games. Are you watching anything for video games, or is that more they'll cut it in where they need it?
Two completely different things. When you're scoring television, almost everything, probably 98% of it, is done to a click.
Right.
So you have a click. Let's just say it's at 120 for whatever reason. So when you write it, you're hearing ding, 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 ding,
Right.
ding,
Right.
ding, and you write it to the click. You write it, and then you use your samples to create a rough and to take a look at it and say, is this working to picture? Thank goodness technology, just like it enables you guys to be in different cities, enables music guys to say, well, this is not going to sound like as good as real strings or real brass, but I can put it all in and watch it against the picture and see how it's working. So you write it to a click. And when you go to the session, yes, you do see it on the big screen, but the timing is already set. Everything is already done. You record it to a click. The click is locked to picture. So it should be, unless something has gone wrong, exactly what you did. And that's how it goes exactly with the picture. Video games, what I saw mostly on Uncharted was little stick figures running around in a jungle. And, they would send you what they call concept art, which is what they think it might look like at the end.
Right.
But just like you're making changes, they make changes all the time.
Right.
And at least the way Naughty Dog works, it only came together at the very end. And then all of a sudden, every day they would drop in a new layer. And you'd go, oh, that is so cool. I wish I'd known this before.
Right.
But you didn't. And it just is what it is. And because in video games, in TV, you do the music and it gets dropped in really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
In video games, you have to do the music and then leave months for putting the music into the game.
Right.
So you record, if you've got 4 years to do it, you may do the music sometime in year 3 so that you have all this time to put the music in. Because, in video games, your contract is usually for about 2 hours worth of music. But that 2 hours has to somehow fill up 10 to 14 hours of game time, depending on how someone plays. So sometimes they will separate, when you record, you will separate stuff. Like, I'll just give you an example. Say we're at Abbey Road and we have the strings and the brass all together in the same room. You rehearse the piece and then you say, okay, brass, everybody sit out and let's just record the low strings, the cello and the basses. So everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but you just record the cello and the basses. Right. Then you record the violas and the violins. Okay, thank you. Then you record maybe just the French horns, then maybe the trumpets. And when you put it all together, it sounds exactly like when you rehearsed it, hopefully. Right. But when they're putting the music into the game, they have ways of just starting off with, let's say, just the low strings, and then adding in other pieces so that it builds, but it's all of a piece, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. And this is another thing that I was going to ask about is, there have been a lot of studies done and people often talk about, like, if you're working at an office or something and you want music on in the background, but you want to remain focused, that's one of the designing principles of video games, maybe even more so than movies, right? Because movies are this passive experience where you're watching it, but in video games, you're doing something and you want music, you want it for that emotional color and you want it to really immerse you, but you also don't want it to be too distracting. So I guess, maybe they're layering it based on that. Maybe in a certain section of the game, they want you really wired in, so they don't want the music to get in the way of that. But I guess a sub question would be, how much would you say that sort of thing influenced your work on with Uncharted and with Naughty Dog?
This will be an elongated answer, but bear with me. One thing I did, when I first took Uncharted, I had never done a video game. I didn't have any experience in that.
Did you play video games, though?
No.
Okay. Interesting.
No. I mean, I do now, but I'm awful. I die every 5 minutes.
We all die. It's okay.
So I didn't, I was unsure of whether or not I should even take the gig because I wanted them to get what they deserved. But I went down to Santa Monica and met with Amy and met with them. And I really liked them. And they were, they said, listen, you just do what you do and we'll make it work. And I said, well, if you can do that, then I will learn as I go and I will learn quickly what's working for you and what's not. That one we had to do fairly quickly because they had waited really longer than you should to hire a composer and get working.
Okay.
So anyway, one thing I did that was not by design is just every piece I would write. So let's say I was writing a piece that was 3.5 minutes long. I would write for 30 or 45 seconds, and then I would build to some sort of musical conclusion. Let's just say you were writing, and then so you had everybody building up, start up again. So I would leave a little space before, a second, 2 seconds before I started up again. What happened on Uncharted 1 is when the music started up again, it would serendipitously catch some event, and the players were calling Sony going, how did you do that? How did you make the music fit the game so it went right with me? And they said, we had to tell them, we didn't. And if you play the game again, that won't happen again. It was a serendipitous occurrence. It was just the luck of the draw.
Yeah.
But that, I asked Sony, I said, should I change that? And I said, oh God, no, keep doing it, because it makes the player feel like the music is going with them on this journey.
Right.
If they play it again, it won't be in the same place, but it'll be someplace different. It'll work.
Exactly. And if you leave those catches in there, there's always a chance, right, that it'll hit at that exact right time where
there's always a chance. So anyway, that was just a discovery thing. In putting the music into the game, and this is why video games are such a team sport, the Sony guys were just great. And they were all great players. Mm-hmm. And so they would put the music into the game. And it turned out sometimes that music that I wrote for one place in the game ended up working better somewhere else.
Right.
And if so, that's fine. I mean, the only rule was make it be fun for the gamer, the person playing the game. Make it be great for them. That's all anybody cared about. And the Sony guys were so good at this, and they spent months sitting in the theater at Naughty Dog, putting music into the game and programming it so that it would start here and this would start here and this would change. This, I was just busy writing music. They were busy taking what I wrote, making it work.
Right.
So we all did it together. And when you think about it, I mean, all I am is the guy who scribbles stuff on paper. It's the orchestra that brings it to life. I mean, they all look at it and say, oh, yeah. And then they make it be something even more than what it looked like on paper. And they make it be beautiful, hopefully, and something with emotion to it. And there's something unique within an orchestra about 80 to 100 people all focused on one thing in one room at the same time.
Right.
There's just an energy there that is unique.
Well, what I've heard it described as by other composers is, you write this music, right? And it sounds good. And, you have your first cut that you were talking about where you're just doing it to a click. And then you get the orchestra in the room and you record it. And the way I've heard it described is it's like watching a child be born. It's this completely different experience and they add so much to it.
I was just kind of wondering, I'm one of those people where I really like to get in the head and understand the creative process. And especially talking about how obviously you have something on paper and then the orchestra brings it to life. How did you even get to the point where you have something on paper? What is kind of the first step in your process? Do you start with a specific instrument or a beat or a melody in your head? And do you start with a script or a moment in the game or something? Or does it just kind of how does it come to you? I guess I'm kind of wondering.
Well, games and TV are very different. So I'll start with TV. Once you get a final cut of the picture, you watch it, and then you've sat down with in TV, you would sit down with the producers of the show. Producers have all the power in TV. Writers, and the director has all the power in film. But you sit down with the producers on the show because you don't sit down with the director because the director just comes in, directs an episode, and then leaves. The producers are the ones who know what works for the franchise. So you watch the picture, and the first thing you kind of have to say is, what's the story they're telling here? And what is the tempo of it? What does it feel like to me? And so you start kind of with the tempo, and then you say, now what's important in this scene? This happens. I'm just making something up. He pulls his gun. Right. Okay, got it. And then it just sits there for a while. But then this changes. So you go, that's a signpost. So I got to mark out the signpost that I want to be sure and have the music change when this happens. And then you just write music from point A to your signpost. And then you kind of go, now from this signpost to the next one, it has changed. See, that's why scoring a scene specifically is going to play one way that you can never do with library music. when you just created a bunch of music, because you're not going to catch any of those things.
It's not reactive. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're not going to catch any of it. In other words, you just have music that just kind of flows underneath, and there you go. But if it's really scored, then the music's going to go with the thing. You don't want to catch too much. You just want to catch the really important parts. And it doesn't have to be a big change. Maybe just another instrument comes in. Maybe it goes to high strings. Maybe low strings come in. A lot of possibilities. And that's how you would score to TV. In a video game, you have freedom that you don't have in TV, because when you're writing the music, there is no dialogue really.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, let's just say you're doing some of the platform things that happen in video games, running, jumping, whatever. All I ever had from Nathan, not Nathan Fillion, but Nathan Drake.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Was
right.
Right.
grunts and I'm tired. That kind of stuff. So you could write these long pieces, and because you weren't bumping against dialogue, you could write all sorts of melodic gestures, big grand melodic things that you could never get away with in television or film, because in order to get away with it in television or film, you'd have to have a scene where nothing was, the only thing that was being featured was the music.
Right.
So it's just a different animal. And I would always talk with Amy and say, what is it that you want this to say? And I knew that I was getting it from the right source, because she was the one who wrote it. She was the one who was producing it. So she knew exactly what she was trying to accomplish. And she gave me insight. And then I was free just to write.
So kind of honing in on Uncharted, obviously like that developed into a franchise. When you signed on for the game, did you know that it was going to turn into a franchise? Did you think it was just like a single game? And when it did turn into a franchise, how did you kind of bring a fresh perspective to each game while still kind of maintaining the same undercurrents of the series and the tone of the games, I guess?
Well, we knew what the thematic device was, but one of the things that was fun about Uncharted is they were always in a different environment, at least in the 3 that I did.
Right.
And in number 4. I mean, I've seen number 4. The first one was in a jungle. So the sounds in a jungle are kind of closed in, a little claustrophobic, because you're inside something. You're inside a jungle. It had lots of ethnic flutes, and it was not big in a cinematic way, because that wasn't what you were looking at. You were looking at something closed in.
Right.
The second one was Tibet, Mongolia, completely different animal. Starts off in a completely different way. Wide open cinematic panoramas, wide open as far as the eye could see, in any direction. Even his hanging off the train, which by the way got reproduced in Fast and Furious, I think. Was it Fast and Furious? I can't remember.
I know what movie you're reaching for, but I can't think of it either.
Yeah, the scene was recreated.
Yeah,
exactly. And by the way, no reason not to. It was a thrilling scene.
Oh, it was an unbelievable start to that game. I'll never forget the start of that game.
It was a fantastic start. So you look at where you are in the jungle. I got to use lots of cool ethnic flutes, and I love doing that. But in the second one, we got to use all these Tibetan temple horns and, all this stuff that was, I love ethnic instruments. I kind of got into that. Joss Whedon got me into that on Firefly, where you would take ethnic instruments and just mix them in with, let's just call it a Western style orchestra. His reasoning was different. His reasoning was, in his post-apocalyptic world, all the cultures were thrown together.
Right.
And you could use Chinese vocals. And by the way, they used Chinese, because he couldn't use curse words on television.
Right. Yeah.
He just said, what is it in Chinese? Say that.
Right.
Oh, yeah. They also did that with some of the text on the ships, too.
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of it's coming out in instrumentation. But I guess to break it down to the theme in Uncharted that everybody knows, right? The French horn driven, the main theme of the game, which persisted through obviously all 4 of them. I guess, is there a story that you remember coming up with that? Did that just kind of come to you? Was it inspired by another piece of music? Because that's the thing that everybody knows, right? It's a huge deal.
I'll tell you the actual truth on this. This will be disappointing. I wrote that piece just because, number one, they gave me the freedom just to write anything.
Right.
I didn't write it with any place specifically in mind. Amy and Naughty Dog and Sony, in their graciousness to me, said, let's just record everything you write. We have no idea how it's all going to fit together, but let's just record it. So we recorded what people know as Nate's theme. We had no idea where to use it in the game. We couldn't figure out where.
Wow, so you didn't know that was the title. See, that's, first of all, it's not a disappointing answer at all. That's a fascinating answer.
So it's the absolute truth. And then all of a sudden somebody said, we've got this thing when the game first boots up and we don't have any music for that. Why don't we toss that in there and see how it works? Tossed it in and they loved it.
Yeah, it became iconic.
It did. Remember I talked about serendipitous occurrences?
Right.
This was one for us. I wrote another piece in the second game. There's a character named Schaefer, and he dies. And I wrote this kind of emotional piece of music using the erhu, which is kind of this primitive Chinese violin. Mm-hmm. And Karen Hahn came and played it. She's the star of the erhu. She works for John Williams and everybody else. If you need an erhu, Karen is the one you call. And it was just a real emotional piece. But we didn't have a place for it. And Sony called me one day. At the end of the games, after they've done the gameplay, they do what they call the cinematics or cut scenes, which are more like scoring film or television because you have dialogue and it goes from point A to point B, and the player's not in control there. So that's something that the player needs to watch because it forwards the story to the next gameplay. And Jonathan said, you know what, we're going to need a piece of music for when Schaefer dies. And I watched it, and I said, that piece of music we can't find a place for? Put it in there. Right. And it just fit.
Mic drop.
Yeah, it just fit. And that was just another thing that was just an occurrence. And it's just one of the joys of letting, people saying, if you were inspired enough to write this, then let's just record it. And even if we can't find a place for it, we'll just have a good version of it. But you hate to do that because you want all the money that you spend to go into the game.
Right. Right.
And we never came away with something that we didn't use somewhere in the game. So that's one of the tricks of you have to book the orchestra when you're working for a week. You have to book them for a certain amount of time. What you don't want to do is leave music on the stand, which means you didn't get everything done. Right. That's a problem. But you also don't want to get finished early and say, well, we don't have any more music and, they're already paid through Friday. You want to try and time it. So just about the time you get done, you go, we got 10 minutes left. Well, that's really hard to plan for that.
I was going to say that has to be incredibly difficult to do.
You plan for it as best you can. You try to keep an eye on where you are in the process, and then you just try to make it work out. You try to adjust as you go and say, boy, we're falling behind. Let's do a couple of music pieces that we probably don't even have to rehearse. If the players just read it, it'll be fine. And then you do that, and the players can always just read it right on the spot. They're so utterly amazing. It's just, what a joy to work with great players. What an absolute joy. So you try to keep track of it and make it work out, but, it is tricky.
Yeah. Well, so I want to talk about Firefly a little bit. We talked about Uncharted a lot. Firefly, its whole shtick, right, is it's a space Western. And that comes through perhaps more than anywhere, in the music. The instrumentation, and you already talked about it, it's a blend of a lot of different cultures, but I would say predominantly it's a mix of this orchestral sci-fi thing, and you have this Western instrumentation in it as well. So was that a design constraint that you were given from the top? Did Joss Whedon say to you, because it sounds like you've spoken to Joss Whedon, which by the way, blows my mind. We're talking to someone who talked to Joss Whedon, but was that kind of the main direction you got, or was it more of just, we're blending every culture we can together in what you're going to do here? No.
Early on, again, before a show starts, everybody talks about what it should be. And you have time. Once a show starts, nobody has really much time to talk about anything because you're just in the throes of production, which takes everybody's time. I'll tell you in a little bit how I got hired on that gig. It's a crazy story. But Joss did say, he said, when we're in space, the last thing I want is French horns going, ba-ba, ba-ba,
Right.
Because Star Trek, has already got that completely covered.
He wanted the mold to be broken.
Well, yeah, let's do something different. Let's do fiddle and dobro and, use colors, because the story we were telling was not about the grandeur of space. It was about these 9 people, this little ragtag group of guys surviving in the midst of this crazy universe.
Right.
And so it was a smaller story, but that was a story that mattered. It was a smaller story. Joss didn't think of it as a Western as much as he thought of it this way. It was a post-apocalyptic world where everything was governed by your resources. And it goes back even to the history of our country. If you were staking a claim in Missouri, then your life was completely different than if you were a Rockefeller living in New York and money was no object.
Mhm.
Two completely different things. And that's why in Joss's world, you could have laser guns or pistols like in the Old West. It all made sense depending on your resources in this post-apocalyptic world. And that made sense to me because the cultures were all thrown together. At any point in time, you could throw in ethnic instrumentation, and that was fine. And it didn't have to make any sense because all the cultures were thrown together. But if you were in 6-shooter land, that was going to be different than if you were in laser gun land. So it was just what he had done. He had created the perfect show. And I had done enough television to know that it was perfect because he had 9 main characters with these wildly divergent pasts. So he could tell stories that could go in all these different directions, and he could go on forever without repeating the same story. Most TV shows have a central conceit, shall we call it. And it's just that same thing week after week. They just change the costumes or change the cars, but it's really the same thing.
So you had mentioned how great Firefly was, and I also like the fact that the music scores needed to be absolutely unique, yet they recycled the troopers' uniforms in that show. But that said, were you surprised when the show was canceled because of how good it was?
Oh, I was shocked. In fact, I cried like a child.
I mean, it's, a lot of people, and I tend to agree, and I'm guessing you do. I mean, people think it was ahead of its time. I mean, also, if I remember correctly, the network aired episodes out of order, which you're setting it up to fail at that point. It just, I mean, if I was you, I would.
Fox was truly the bad guy in this situation.
It seems that way.
Okay, I'll tell you my version of that story.
Okay, I love that.
First, I'll tell you how I got hired, and then I'll continue on.
Right.
Everybody knew Joss was doing this new show. And this was back before MP3s. So they said he wouldn't take calls from anybody's agent because he just wouldn't. So they said, just send in a CD, and if we're interested, we'll get back to you. Well, I mean, this is Los Angeles. So about the time your CD hit the bottom of the mail bin, you'd already moved on. You weren't going to go home and wait for the phone to ring.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But one day the phone rang. And they said, this is Joss Whedon's office. Would you be interested in talking to Joss about this new show? And I said, oh, absolutely. And they said, can you come down to Fox tomorrow and let's talk about it? I said, absolutely. Hung up the phone, and I said, I am so screwed. I've never seen an episode of Buffy or Angel. And he's going to say, what'd you like? And I'm just going to have to say, oh, there's so much. I can't even narrow it down to one. That's what you say when you see a really bad film and you see the director. You go, yeah, I've never seen anything like that. How to save face in Hollywood. But I went down, and they said, so this will be a 5-minute meeting. And Joss and I just started talking about different stuff. And then we started arguing about guitar players. He was going, so this Jeff Beck tune is the best tune he's ever done. And I said, no, that's a good tune, but this tune is an even better tune. And he says, you are so full of shit. I said, no, sir, you are full of shit. And we were just having fun. And so our 5-minute meeting lasted 2 hours. And at the end, he just said, call your agent and tell him you got the gig. And I said, wow. And so I walked out, and in his office, I saw a wall of CDs. And I said, oh, I know that guy. He's great. And I know her. She's better than the other 3 guys put together. I have no idea how in the world they picked my CD out of that wall of great music. But every now and then, miracles happen. So there you go. So on to the show in Fox. Joss had made a 2-hour pilot. It was a $10 million pilot. That's a lot of money for a TV pilot.
Yeah.
That's film type money. Fox looked at it and said, we're not showing it. They always hated this show. It just wasn't what they wanted. Even the main title that Joss wrote, his vision, what Fox wanted was an action show. They wanted
Right.
nonstop action with a little bit of talking. And by the way, that's what they replaced it with. I think it was a show called Fast Lane or something, two guys in a car. Great.
Same old, right?
Yeah, exactly. What Joss wanted to do was create a show that had moral conundrums, and people and people did the wrong thing, but then ultimately did the right thing. Just like when Jane sold out River in, I think it was Ariel was the name of it. But then at the end, Mal locks him in the airlock, and he doesn't want people to know what he did. And I love that. Mal could never tell Anara that he loved her, but he did. But he just could never say it. And I really wanted to know where that story was going. And Joss, I said, I really want to know. And he said, well, I know, well, great. That doesn't help me. He didn't tell me.
I even read that Fox was against that relationship potentially evolving as well. So it's been a lot of controversy that this show had to deal with when it first came out. And I agree with what you said earlier, that it was truly ahead of its time.
Fox just hated it. And what we never could figure out is, why did they pick it up then? Why didn't they just go to Joss and say, you know what, this is not the show for us, but we wish you great luck. We hope to work in the future. That would have been the right thing to do. Instead, they did all the things that you talked about. They aired them out of order. They went to Joss and said, we're not showing the 2-hour pilot, so write another episode. And he said, I can't introduce 9 main characters in an hour.
Right.
So I can't give people the arc of the show without everybody knowing why these people are together. They start off not being together. And then they come together, and we have to know why. And Fox said, we don't care. We're not showing it.
That's just so hard to fathom. I can't.
It really is. It really is. Well, here's the way TV works. When everything used to go on the air in September, which Firefly did, you start shooting in July. So even though Fox was saying we're not going to air the 2-hour pilot, you'd already shot a lot of several episodes. You couldn't make wholesale changes. You could make little changes.
Right.
You can't go back and reshoot them. There's neither the time nor the money. So everybody tried to address it and say, Fox just seems to hate it. What can we do to make it better for them? Because if we get to the second part of the season, and every TV show is this way, you get to the second part of the season and everybody sees what was working. Now they can write the things that really, really work. And then when you get to season 2, it's a completely different animal, and it should be firing on all cylinders by the beginning of season 2. Right. Firefly never got that chance. And it just never got that chance. And yet it still was even good right out of the gate. It was good right out of the box, but I knew what it could be, and I knew what he intended it to be.
Right.
The thing that I loved about Firefly, some of the bad guys I could live without, but the crew, those 9 characters, whenever they were together, that was magic.
It was unbelievably rich. And I totally agree with what you said about, and I can think of countless examples of shows that, they don't hit their stride until season 2. And I would even go so far, with Firefly, like you said, they kind of hit their stride, from the word go. But my favorite episode has to be The Message, which I believe was the last one that was filmed, with the funeral scene at the end. Just amazing, and your score there is amazing. And it was hard for me because I only watched the show a few years ago. I obviously didn't watch it when it was first on because I was a lot younger. But I remember watching that and thinking, how the hell did this get canceled? So I have to imagine in your position, you had to be absolutely shocked.
Again, we hope for the best. By the time, they made 15 episodes, I think counting the 2-hour pilot as 2 episodes. They finally aired the 2-hour pilot. They aired it on a Friday before Christmas when everybody was leaving town.
Right.
Here, Fox even had the World Series even back then. So they started airing Firefly. They showed 1 or 2 episodes. And then they said, by the way, we're taking off for the World Series, so we'll see you in a few weeks.
Jeez.
They put it on Friday night. Nobody is at home on Friday night except kids who are too young to drive.
Right.
Everything that you could do to destroy it, they did. And yet it has lived beyond anything else they had on the air.
Yeah.
It's utterly amazing. Imagine what could have happened.
A colossal mistake.
When I looked at the 2-hour pilot, my life is always going from gig to gig because that's what happens. Every now and then you work on something that lasts a long time. I was one of the 3 that, did King of the Hill. Well, that lasted 12 years. That's delightful.
Right.
But I looked at the pilot on Firefly and I said, man, I am working for 10 years. 10 years before I have to go get another gig. Yay!
Right.
Little did I know it was going to be closer to 10 episodes. So the last one I did was exactly the one you talked about, the message. And that last scene was my opportunity to say goodbye to the show that I so loved.
And it comes through. It really does.
Does it really?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you can tell, I don't think it's just your work either. I think it's the work of the cast. I mean, watching that scene, the funeral in the snow, like, I don't know at that point if all the actors knew, if Joss knew, if you knew, but
no, nobody knew.
It just feels that way, I guess. But
nobody knew. But I looked at that and I said, here's an opportunity to write music because you got all the cast in one place and they're not talking. Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
They're just looking. You have voiceover, but you don't have them having a conversation that you have to stay out of the way of. So you can do something a little bit different. And again, for me, it was an opportunity to, I guess I did know the show was canceled because I knew I was saying goodbye to them. The schedule on Firefly was ridiculous. And they told me, they said, when we get to the second half of the season, we'll give you more time. I pretty much had 4 days to score it.
Man, that's nuts.
Because I was using, individual instruments, I couldn't score it all. At King of the Hill, I scored all at once. Here, I had to have individual players come over, and that's very time consuming.
Right. Right.
So they said, once we get to the second part of the season, we'll give you more time. Well, we never got there. So it was just a crunch. But, when I finally knew it was canceled, I just, everybody else, the editors, everybody else had already processed the information and they were on hiatus. It was just the post-production guys, me and the effects and, all those guys bringing up the tail end. And I just remember being in Joss's office and, tears just came because I knew I'd move on to another gig, but it wasn't going to be the same gig because there really wasn't anything in television like that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it wasn't going to be the same gig. Joss was beyond the tear phase and he was just pissed.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And rightly so. If that's just how that worked out, but it was a goofy thing, and Fox just hated it from the beginning. And there's a weird thing in TV. You get promoted even if you fail utterly, and that's just a TV thing. I don't know if you remember there was a show called Married with Children.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, Christina Applegate. I forget what the name of it was. It Kelly? Was that her name? I can't remember in the show. But she gets invited to a stupid party where everybody's supposed to invite the stupidest person they know. So Bud shows up and he says, Kelly, this is a stupid party. They invited you because you're stupid. And she says, no, that can't be true. And he said, it's true. So she taps on the shoulder of the guy in front of her. She says, what do you do for a living? And he said, I'm a television executive. And she said, it's true. It's true. So anyway, the people who destroyed Firefly went on to bigger and better careers, so they got rewarded for their
destruction.
It's the Dilbert principle at work.
It is. Here's the way they reason it. They go, well, yeah, they failed, but at least they know how to run a studio.
Right.
Into the ground. Yeah, I get it. But anyway,
you need to promote them so that they're at a level where they can't ruin anything anymore.
If only such a thing were possible. But
right.
It's a goofy world, but you know what? I'm thrilled that I was a part of that, and what a wonderful thing to be a part of. But both of those franchises have had a shelf life beyond the ordinary. I would rather do a project that I really believe in than to do 7 others that I don't. And both of those have been great for me. And I'm thrilled and honored to have been a part of them.
So we've already talked about some really incredible franchises, but if you can work on absolutely anything, what's your dream project, past or future, that you could score or rescore?
That's impossible. I wouldn't want to rescore anything. And I like 1,000 different things for 1,000 different reasons. Mm-hmm. Anything that is a great story, well told, is fun for me. There are some films that I think are just almost perfect. One of them would be Shawshank Redemption.
Love Shawshank Redemption.
Me too. And, usually when people do voiceover, it's because they didn't know how to tell their story. So the story's unclear. And they go, we better do a voiceover so people know what's going on. But Morgan Freeman's was completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And Shawshank
Andy Dufresne.
That was almost the perfect film. So I wouldn't want to redo it because it was almost perfect.
Yeah, Thomas Newman did a really good job.
But I would love to do something of that quality and be part of that. There's so many things that I like for different reasons. I used to start off liking certain composers. Now I like a gazillion composers for a gazillion different reasons. It's all just, the certain guy on the certain project. Stylistically, they can all be different. But being part of the storytelling, we're all storytellers. And being part of the storytelling process with people who are just as good at what they do as you hope to be at what you do, and just bringing it all together, making something bigger than the sum of its parts. That's what I love to do. And that's what I would love to do in the future.
So speaking of the future, is there anything that you're working on now that you can tell us about?
There's one thing that I can't tell you about because they have non-disclosure agreements. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of a slow time, and Hollywood has brought COVID has kind of slowed this process down to a crawl. So it'll be interesting to see if and when we get back up to running. I kind of don't think, because the rules right now for filming are very, very stringent if you're filming in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And some companies are even going out of the United States. The only other big place to really work is Georgia. But some people are going to Europe, to Prague and places like that to film, because then you're not bound necessarily by SAG-AFTRA rules. But those are really, really stringent about how many people can be on the set, how many people can be in the scene, such that really good actors kind of go, I don't know if we can make good product with these kind of rules. It's hard enough to make good product anyway.
Right.
But to have these rules, so I don't know when we're going to get back to when you can just, if we have a vaccine, that'd be delightful, so we can just get back to filming for the sake of filming, being bound only by the story, not by all the rules that are put on top of all that. So it'll be interesting to see. I kind of don't see it coming as a point in time, more as a process where you begin to see things getting better and finally you just realize we're back to where we were. Maybe 2022, I don't know. But anyway, project-wise, that's what I would like to do. So I've got one that I'm working on, and we'll see what happens with that. But
we're excited to see whatever that is when we can finally talk about it and hear more of your work. Because, obviously, we've been talking for an hour, and everything that you've worked on so far, has just been absolutely incredible. So I'm sure any future projects, you will bring that same level of just passion and amazing composing skills to whatever it is that you're working on.
I really hope to find one in the future. And, you build on everything. Everything you did teaches you. I have yet to do a project, even something I didn't get paid for, where I didn't learn something. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is you just want to continue to bring everything that you learn and then put it on the table for somebody else. And then at some point you die, but you hope to find a place to use everything. All of these things are skills. It's the same thing for lighting, the same thing for screenwriting. And you just hope to have the opportunity to take everything you learned and use it for somebody else, if that makes any sense.
Yep, absolutely. So before we sign off today, there's something that we've been asking all of our interviewees, trying to assemble our own little podcast Avengers, if you will. If you can have any superpower, what would it be?
I saw that in your questions, and I thought about it, and I don't have a good answer for you. It's not because I didn't think about it. It's just because at this point in my life, I'm so concerned with being the best me that I can be, that I don't extrapolate too far beyond that, because I'm not even accomplishing that, if you understand my point. So I don't really know. I don't know what superpower I would have. I could think of 1,000 things to say. I want to be the best person, the best human being that I can be.
I think that's
qualifies. A pretty good answer.
Yeah, I think that totally qualifies, and it also is especially unique relative to other answers we've gotten. So I'm perfectly satisfied with that, and I think it's a message for everyone. We can all try and always try and be better.
Fair enough.
So yeah, we're gonna wrap up here, but we do, of course, want to thank Greg for spending so much time with us, talking to us about the ins and outs of his industry and the work that he's done. Thank you again, Greg. It's been a huge pleasure.
It has been an honor. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope our paths cross again in the very near future.
Can't wait for that.